Ethan Cole stepped off the evening bus with a small bag slung across his shoulder and a tired heart that felt heavier than all his years away. The air smelled like pine trees and rain. The town looked almost the same as when he had left it long ago. Same quiet streets. Same playground by the corner store. Even the old church bell still rang at 6, echoing through the hills. Yet something felt different. He could not name what it was. He only knew that time had moved on, while he was still trying to find the pieces of himself he had lost somewhere far from home. The road to his family house wound along a narrow creek. The water glimmered between the trees. Each step brought back memories of running through these woods with muddy shoes, laughing while his grandfather yelled good-natured warnings not to fall in. His grandparents' house had always been the heart of his world. 2 stories high, white shutters, a swing on the porch where stories were told until sunset. He had imagined walking back into it countless times during his years away. In his dreams, the porch light was always waiting for him, shining like a promise. But when he reached the edge of the clearing, he froze. The house was not how he had left it. The faded paint was fresh and clean. Smoke rose gently from the chimney. Curtains fluttered in the windows, thin and bright, as if someone cared to make the place alive again. On the porch lay a small ball, painted with red stripes. A child's laughter rang out from the backyard. For a moment, Ethan thought he must have come to the wrong house. But the old willow tree in the front yard told him he was exactly where he should be. It was the same tree where he had carved his name as a boy. The same tree that still bent slightly to the right after the storm of '94. This was his house, his land. Yet strangers were living in it. Unsure what to do, he climbed the porch steps. The wood creaked under his boots, familiar and strange at the same time. He lifted his hand to knock on the door but hesitated. What could he even say? "Hello, you are in my home." He almost turned away, thinking he'd gone mad, when the door opened from inside. A woman stood there with flour on her cheeks and a pie held carefully in her hands. She looked surprised but not afraid. "Can I help you?" she asked. Ethan blinked. She had kind eyes and soft brown hair tied behind her neck. Her clothes were simple, her tone polite but cautious. He felt awkward standing there like a lost soul. I used to live here," he said finally. "This was my grandparents' home." Her expression shifted, uncertain for a moment, then gentle. "Oh, you must be Mr. Cole, the man from the pictures," he frowned. Before he could ask, 2 small faces peeked out from behind her legs. A little boy and a girl, no older than 8 or 9. The boy held a small wooden plane in his hand, the kind Ethan's grandfather used to carve. The girl hid half her face behind her mother's skirt but smiled shyly. "I'm Laura Bennett," the woman said. "These are my children, Noah and Lily." Ethan nodded slowly. "How long have you been here?" "Almost 2 years now," she said softly. "We rented the house through a real estate agent in town. It's been such a blessing for us." He felt the ground shift a little beneath his feet. He had never rented or sold this property. It was still in his name, or at least it should have been. But as he looked past her shoulder into the warm glow of the kitchen, he saw a life where there used to be dust and emptiness. Photos hung neatly on the wall beside a shelf of books. Children's drawings lined the fridge. The smell of baked apple pie filled the air, mixing with something like cinnamon and warmth. His first thought wasn't anger but confusion and, strangely, comfort. The house was alive again. Someone had loved it back into being. Laura's eyes softened. She must have read the storm of emotions crossing his face. "You've come a long way," she said. "Look like you could use some rest. Would you like to sit for a moment?" Ethan hesitated but nodded. She led him inside, and the familiar creaking of the floor greeted him like an old friend. He sat at the edge of the dining table while Noah and Lily whispered to each other from the doorway, curious but polite. Laura set a plate with a slice of warm pie in front of him. He stared at it for a long time before taking the first bite. The taste was sweet and simple. Something about it reminded him of how his grandmother used to bake on Sunday afternoons while humming old songs. He swallowed and looked around again. The family pictures on the mantelpiece drew his eye. One photo caught his attention, a man in uniform standing beside Laura, smiling proudly. A folded flag rested near the frame. Ethan's throat tightened. Something about that picture would come back to him later, something important and unexpected. But for now, he only sat quietly, listening to the soft sounds of children's footsteps and the woman's gentle voice, asking if he wanted more pie. He did not answer at once. He only looked through the window at the fading light. The place felt the same but new, familiar but touched by hands that cared in a different way. He had returned home to find strangers inside his memories. Yet deep down, he sensed his story was not ending here. It was only beginning. Ethan woke before sunrise the next morning. Sky outside glowed faint pink as he stood by the window of the small motel room he had found in town. Sleep had not come easily. All night his mind circled back to the same thought. Who was Laura Bennett, and why was she living in his house? The papers for the property had been left in his safe deposit box before he went overseas. He was certain no one else had the right to rent or sell it, yet the woman's honesty had felt real. The confusion turned in his chest like a knot he could not untie. After grabbing a cup of coffee from the diner near the bus station, he walked toward the property office on Main Street. The town's rhythm greeted him like a faint memory. People waved without looking twice, a sign that small-town kindness still lived here. Inside the office, an old ceiling fan hummed as a man in suspenders looked up from behind the desk. His nameplate read Martin Gibbs. Ethan explained that his family home had been rented without his knowledge. Martin frowned, flipping through a worn registry book. He found the listing number, checked the signature, and looked up again. "Everything looks official," he said. The payment records matched the name on the lease. Ethan leaned closer. "What name?" Martin turned the page and said quietly, "The signature here reads Richard Cole. That would be your father, correct?" The word struck Ethan like a blow. His father had passed away 4 years earlier. They had not spoken much before his death, and Ethan had only learned the details through a letter sent overseas. He stared at the curling ink of the signature. It looked almost like his father's handwriting, but older and uneven. He stepped back, feeling something heavy press against his ribs. The land and the house were more than property. They were the last link to the people who had raised him, the only place where all his memories still breathed. Martin cleared his throat. "I suppose your father must have signed the lease before he passed. Maybe he thought it best to let someone look after the house, instead of leaving it empty." Ethan nodded slowly, though the unease would not leave him. He thanked the man and walked outside into the morning light. The truth seemed tangled and incomplete. Still, one thing became clear. Laura and the children had not come by accident. They were not intruders. They were there because someone from his own bloodline had allowed it. He returned to Willow Creek Road later that afternoon. The air smelled of wood smoke and wildflowers. As he approached the house, he saw Noah running in the yard with a toy plane. The boy waved at him with a bright smile that eased some of his tension. Laura was on the porch fixing a loose shutter. She looked up, surprised but not displeased to see him again. "You came back," she said. "I spoke to the man in town," he replied. "Seems my father rented the house to you before he passed away." Laura lowered the hammer slowly. Her face softened with something like sorrow. "I did not know he was gone. He was kind to us when we first came. He let us move in right away. Said no family should stay on the road when winter was near." Ethan watched the children playing. The sound of their laughter filled the yard. It struck him how alive the place felt compared to the silence he had left behind. His anger began to fade, replaced by a slow warmth of understanding. His father, distant and hard as he had been, must have seen something in this family that reminded him of what kindness was for. Laura invited him again to sit, and this time he did not hesitate. She poured lemonade into 2 glasses and told him about her past. Her husband, Daniel, had passed away suddenly 2 years before. She had been left with debts, 2 frightened children, and no home. She worked part-time at the school library and spent evenings sewing to earn a little extra. The house on Willow Creek had been her safe harbor. Ethan listened quietly, watching as the sun dipped behind the trees. Each word she spoke painted a picture of loss and strength. He understood the hollow sound she carried under her calm voice. It was the same sound he had lived with for years after the war. Loss was a bond no one asked for, yet it tied people in invisible ways. When the children went inside to wash their hands for supper, Laura smiled faintly. "I hope it is all right that we are here. If you need the house back, I can move us somewhere else, though. It may take time." Ethan looked at the house again, and at the worn swing where his grandmother used to sit. The light from the window fell across Laura's careful hands, across the laughter echoing faintly from inside. He realized that the house had not been taken from him. It had been given a new story while he had drifted away from his own. "You should stay," he said quietly. This place suits you and the children better than anyone." Laura's eyes widened slightly, then softened. She thanked him not with words but with a look that carried more peace than any sentence could hold. Ethan left soon after, walking down the dirt road as the first stars began to show. The confusion that had haunted him felt lighter. He did not yet understand how his father and this family were connected, but he no longer doubted that there was a reason. Something deep within the soil of that place tied their lives together. He could feel it already, like a gentle pull, that would soon tell him more than he was ready to believe. Ethan spent the next few days walking the land around the house. The fields were greener than he remembered, and the creek behind the barn still whispered the same tune it had since his childhood. The sound calmed his thoughts, but questions still pressed at him. He wanted to understand how his father had met Laura and why he had chosen her family to live here. The longer Ethan stayed, the more he noticed things that did not belong to his memories. A set of wind chimes hung near the porch, made from silver keys. A small garden had grown near the side fence with rows of tomatoes and herbs. The changes felt gentle, like the house had received a new breath of life without losing its heart. One evening, Laura asked him to come inside for supper. She said the children insisted, and he could not refuse the eager faces watching him from the door. Inside the kitchen, the table was filled with the kind of simple food he had not tasted in years: stew, bread, and berries from the garden. Noah talked about school and how he wanted to build a treehouse near the big willow. Lily listened quietly, holding her doll as if it were a secret friend. Their voices filled the room with warmth that reminded Ethan of everything he had once missed. After the meal, Laura cleared the plates and told him she wanted to show him something. She led him upstairs to the small study room where the window looked out over the back fields. On the desk lay several old letters tied together with a thin ribbon. She picked them up carefully and handed them to him. "These were in the drawer when we moved in," she said. "Your father told me to keep them safe. He said one day you might come back and they would belong to you." Ethan sat down and began to untie the ribbon. The paper was yellowed at the edges, the handwriting neat and looped in a style that looked familiar but older than his father's. As he read the first letter, his breath caught. It was written by his grandmother, Rose Cole. She had died when he was a boy, but her voice seemed to rise from the page. In the letter she spoke about kindness, about how the house was built as a place of refuge, not only for their own family, but for anyone who needed peace. She wrote that if ever the Cole house stood empty, it should welcome someone who had lost their home. Ethan's eyes moved across the lines slowly, as if afraid that reading too fast might make the words fade. The letters that followed spoke of hope after war, of helping neighbors, of never letting the land grow silent. It struck him that his father must have found these letters after her death and had chosen to honor her words. The truth carried both sadness and comfort. His father had not betrayed him by renting the house. He'd simply kept a promise. Laura watched him close the last letter. Her voice was quiet when she said, "Your grandmother's words helped me too. I read them often after Daniel passed. She talked about how a home is more than walls. It is a place that listens when hearts are tired. I believe she wrote them for people like us." Her words touched him deeply. He nodded slowly, understanding why she belonged here almost as much as he did. Yet another letter lay separate from the bundle. When he turned it over, he saw his grandfather's name written in strong handwriting. It was addressed to a man named Daniel Bennett. Ethan looked up sharply. "Your husband's name was Daniel Bennett." Laura nodded, watching his face grow pale. She said yes, Daniel had served in the army before they met. He had told her stories about his time overseas, but rarely spoke of details. Ethan opened the letter and began to read aloud. It was written decades earlier by his grandfather, Henry Cole. The words were simple, but carried great gratitude. Henry wrote of a young soldier named Daniel who had once saved his life during an ambush when their unit was surrounded. He promised to repay that act of bravery one day, even if it took a lifetime. When Ethan finished reading, silence filled the room. The only sound was the soft wind brushing against the window pane. Laura looked at him with wide eyes. "So your grandfather wrote to my husband?" "I never knew." Ethan placed the letter down, his hands trembling slightly. "It seems our families have been connected long before either of us was born." She gave a small nod. Her eyes reflected both wonder and grief. "Feels like the house knew before we did." That night Ethan could not sleep. He stood outside on the porch looking at the glow from the upstairs window where Laura read to her children. The pieces of the puzzle turned slowly in his mind. His grandfather had been saved by Daniel. His father had opened the home to Daniel's family. Now Laura and her children had brought warmth back into the house that had gone cold. He realized that the ties between their families were not made by chance. They were formed through gratitude, duty, and something that felt deeper than destiny. He understood what the house had become. It was more than a shelter. It was a bridge between past and present, between lives touched by loss and courage. The letters were proof that love could outlive those who shared it. He looked toward the willow tree and thought he saw movement there. Only the wind, perhaps, but it made him think of the people who had once called this place home. Somewhere in that quiet air, he felt their blessing, as if the spirit of his grandparents still watched over the land they had built with their hands. When he went inside, Noah had left the model plane on the porch rail. Ethan lifted it gently, running his fingers along its smooth wooden wings. Then he smiled faintly. The house had given him back more than his memories. It had given him meaning again. The story his grandparents began was still being written, and now he was part of it once more. Ethan woke early the next day. A thin layer of mist still covered the fields, and the grass sparkled with dew. The world felt quiet, almost waiting. He had spent much of the night thinking about the letters. The story of how their families had crossed paths long ago stirred something deep inside him. It was strange and beautiful to realize that his grandfather's life had been saved by the husband of the woman now living in his home. It felt less like coincidence and more like a thread stretched through time, connecting their hearts even before they met. When he reached the porch, the smell of breakfast greeted him. Laura was already up, pouring coffee while Lily arranged plates on the table. Noah sat near the window, drawing a picture of an airplane. His eyes lit up when he saw Ethan. "I drew it for you," he said proudly. "You were a soldier like my dad. Mom says that makes you brave." Ethan smiled at the boy. "Your dad was the brave one," he said softly. Laura set a plate of toast in front of him. "You found the letters last night," she said. "I could see your light on in the study." "Yes," Ethan answered. "They changed how I see everything. I understand now why my father trusted you with this house." It was not just about a promise. It was about paying back a debt of kindness. She nodded slowly. The morning sunlight touched her hair, and for a moment, Ethan thought how peaceful she looked. "Sometimes life brings people together in ways we cannot plan," she said. Daniel always believed that good deeds find their way home. After breakfast, they walked outside. Noah ran ahead, chasing a butterfly through the tall grass, while Lily followed a few steps behind. Ethan and Laura walked side by side toward the willow tree. The wind rustled its long branches, whispering softly. "This land meant everything to my grandparents," Ethan said. "They built the house themselves. Grandfather used to say that every nail held a story." Laura looked at the horizon where sunlight turned the fields golden. "I can feel that. The house has a calmness in its walls. When I came here after Daniel's death, I felt lost. The first night I heard the wind move through the trees, and it felt like a lullaby. I knew we were meant to stay." Ethan listened quietly. Her words painted the same feeling he had when he first stepped back onto the property. The land seemed to breathe with the memory of everyone who had ever loved it. It no longer felt like something he owned. It felt like something that owned all of them, each generation leaving pieces of its soul behind. Later that day, they began cleaning out the attic together. Dust floated in the air like soft smoke. Old trunks and boxes filled with forgotten things surrounded them. Among them, Ethan found an oil lamp he remembered from his childhood, still faintly smelling of kerosene. Laura found a small music box covered in faded blue paint. When she turned the key, a gentle tune filled the room. Lily spun in slow circles, pretending to dance, while Noah clapped his hands. Laura smiled faintly. "This tune was in one of Daniel's letters to me," she said. "He wrote that when he was stationed overseas, he would hear a local band playing a lullaby that reminded him of peace. He hummed it whenever he felt afraid." Ethan realized then that even music had followed its way from one life into another, like the house itself carrying echoes of old moments. The feeling was not sadness, but something deeper, a kind of reverence. When evening came, Laura lit a lamp on the porch, and they all sat outside. The children told stories about school and asked Ethan to share stories about his travels. He kept his stories simple, choosing the lighter ones. He told them about sleeping under bright desert skies and how sometimes the stars looked close enough to touch. Noah asked if he ever got scared. Ethan answered truthfully that everyone does, but courage meant doing what must be done anyway. After the children went to bed, the air turned cooler. The night was quiet except for the crickets and the steady whisper of the creek. Ethan sat while Laura folded a small blanket over her knees. "Do you miss him?" he asked softly. "Every day," she said, "but not in the same way as before. I do not cry as much now. This place has helped heal us. It feels like his spirit lingers somehow, as if he knows we are safe." Ethan looked toward the window where a faint light shone from the children's room. "I think my grandparents would feel the same way," he said. "They wanted this house to give people peace. Somehow it found you at the right time." Laura's eyes met his, and it brought you home too. He felt the truth of her words settle deeply in his chest. His return had not been random. The same promise that had guided his father to help her had guided him back to their door. The invisible thread between them was not fragile anymore. It felt strong, steady, built from shared loss and quiet hope. As the moon climbed higher, Laura rose to go inside. Before she did, she looked back. "Thank you for letting us stay," she said. Ethan's answer was simple. "Thank you for bringing life back here." She smiled and closed the door behind her, leaving him alone with the stars. For the first time in many years, Ethan felt that he was exactly where he needed to be. The night pressed softly against the world, and the old house behind him sighed like it was content, as if it too knew that a long circle of promises had finally found its place of rest. Winter melted into spring, and the land around Willow Creek came alive again. The fields turned green, and the air carried the soft scent of new grass. Ethan had stayed longer than he planned. What began as a short visit became part of his days. He helped Laura mend the fence, plant seeds for vegetables, and fix the old swing that had long been crooked. He laughed when Noah asked him to teach him how to fly a kite, and smiled when Lily proudly showed the tiny flowers she had found near the creek. The house no longer felt like a stranger's place. It had become a bridge between old memories and new beginnings. One evening, Ethan received a letter from the lawyer who had handled his father's estate. Inside was the final confirmation that the property's rights still belonged to him completely. All he had to do was sign a few papers to make the house entirely his again. He sat at the porch table, the letter open in front of him, while the wind shook the willow branches above his head. The sound seemed to whisper questions he could not ignore. The more he stared at the paper, the heavier his chest felt. He heard footsteps and looked up to see Laura stepping out with a cup of tea. "You look troubled," she said gently. "The house is mine," Ethan said. "Legally, I could take it back. But it does not feel right. Every part of me says this house belongs to more than a name on paper." She sat down across from him. "You do not have to decide now. I understand that it is your family's land. You have every right to it." He shook his head. "My grandmother wanted this home to help people who lost their way. You and your children have given it life again. I think she would want that more than anything." For a long moment they sat in silence, the creek softly murmuring beyond the hill. The light from the window behind them glowed through the curtains. It felt warm and steady. Finally, Ethan spoke again. "I'm going to make the house yours. You should have it." Laura's eyes widened. "Ethan, you do not have to do that. You have already given us a home when we had none." He smiled faintly. "You gave this home its heart back. That is something no one else could do." She looked down at her hands, trying to find words. "If your grandmother could see this, she would be proud," she said finally. The next day, Ethan went into town and signed the papers. He sold the house to Laura for $1, making it official. When he handed her the deed that evening, she touched the paper carefully, as if it were something fragile. The children clapped, not understanding the weight of what had happened, only that it made their mother happy. For a while they talked on the porch while the sun sank behind the hills. Then Noah brought out an old jar filled with fireflies he had caught near the creek. Their tiny lights flickered in the dusk, like stars come to earth. Lily chased them with laughter that echoed through the quiet valley. The sight filled Ethan's heart with a calm he had not felt since childhood. This was what home was meant to be. As the months passed, Ethan found work helping a friend restore old buildings around the county. He stayed nearby, renting a small cabin close to town. Yet almost every evening he returned to Willow Creek to visit. Sometimes they shared supper. Sometimes they simply sat outside watching the children play. Life settled into a rhythm that felt simple and right. One evening, as summer began to fade, Laura handed him an envelope. "I found something while clearing the attic again," she said. Inside was a small folded note written in his grandmother's handwriting. The ink was faded, but the message was clear. It said, "The heart finds its home when kindness returns to it." Ethan read the line twice, then smiled, as the note felt like a final blessing from those who came before. He looked around at the house, the fields, the children laughing in the grass, and Laura watching with a peaceful smile. Everything about that moment felt complete. Later that night, when the stars appeared and the crickets began to sing, Ethan stood beneath the willow tree. The wind moved through its branches, brushing his shoulder like an old friend. He closed his eyes for a moment and took a slow breath. The house, the land, and the people within it had become more than memories. They were the living proof of promises kept, of families forever intertwined, of love that reached across generations. He turned toward the porch where warm light spilled through the window. Inside, Laura was reading to the children. Her voice drifted out softly into the night. Ethan knew then that the story of Willow Creek would continue long after him. It would carry the laughter of children, the quiet strength of a widow who rebuilt her hope, and the humble gratitude of a man who finally found peace. As he walked down the path toward the gate, he looked back one last time. The house stood strong under the silver light. The willow branches moved lightly in the wind as if waving. He smiled, feeling something gentle and steady settle in his heart. The journey that started with loss had led him home again in a way he had never expected. The soul of the house was alive, and so was his. And in that quiet truth, Ethan Cole knew that the circle was complete, and his heart, at last, was at rest.